enlightening for me. And thank you so much. It's 7:30 in the morning. Good morning.
Thank you.
And I hope that you had a cup of tea or coffee or something.
It meant I can sleep an hour later today. I usually get up earlier than this.
Okay, so I would like to introduce you to Dr. Umair Anas. He's the research director of the think tank Center for India West Asia Dialogue. And yours is the last lecture of Understanding Palestine lecture series. And I'm very excited, but I will keep the friend part apart and talk to you as an academic in this conference. Yeah, so with this, I would hand over the stage, virtual stage to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I want to thank Shupta, and I want to thank the Center for India and West Africa Dialogue, West Asia Dialogue, for the opportunity to address you from Chicago. But still, I extend my solidarity and support for your work. It's very clear that in response to Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel, that Israel has sunk into the depths of utter barbarism. Its indiscriminate attack against and war against Hamas, which does not distinguish, of course, between civilians and combatants, is clearly aimed at killing as many Palestinians as possible and is genocidal in nature. This is shocking, but actually it's not surprising, since this kind of inhumanity is consistent with what the Israeli state has been doing for decades. Clearly, at least in my view, the Israeli rulers had betrayed the most important lesson of the Holocaust, which was never again. When Jews first uttered those words, never again, it meant never again. The genocide should never again occur to anyone. But for Israel's rulers for a long time now, it doesn't mean that. It means never again should Jews be subjected to genocide, but the price to be paid for that is to commit genocide against others if need be, namely the Palestinians. That is turning everything completely on its head. Now, this has had a terribly corrupting influence, this turning around, on many Jews in Israel and around the world. Zionism has proven as damaging to the soul of the Jewish people as the Holocaust had damaged its body. But I wish to emphasize, there are two worlds in every country and every community. Zionism is not identical with Jews or Judaism, nor does it speak for Jews or Judaism. The only thing that the Israeli state and its supporters share with the Islamic fundamentalists of Hamas and its supporters is that they both deny this basic fact. The principles of social justice, which was integral to what it meant to be Jewish for centuries, is being buried under a pile of rubble by a state that claims to rule in the name of Jews. But we must not become ideological accomplices in this crime by presuming that there is a straight line from the Jewish struggle for self-determination and freedom to Zionism and what the Israeli state has been doing. There's not a straight line at all. The two are not the same. So let me begin here in terms of the history. The Jewish people have always felt an important bond to Jerusalem and the Holy Land, but that has nothing to do with Zionism. Prior to the late 1800s, early 1900s, if not later than that, for religious Jews, the return to Jerusalem comes with the Messiah and proclaiming the Day of Judgment. It has nothing to do with creating a political state or resurrecting one, independent of that. For secular Jews, any return to Jerusalem was seen as pointless. It might have been referenced, but it was seen as pointless. They sought to achieve religious and civil emancipation within the diaspora, where they were living outside of Palestine. So the vast majority of Jews opposed Zionism prior to the 1950s, vast majority. And a significant minority of Jews in Israel, but especially even more so around the world, and increasingly in the United States, oppose Zionism as well. Now, Israel and its allies are working feverishly to deny this by weaponizing anti-Semitism against Israel's critics. This is not just directed at non-Jews who criticize Israel. This is most of all, I want to make it clear, directed against Jews who oppose Israel. I'll give you just two examples from where I'm sitting in Chicago, USA. There is a very important organization that has led many of the demonstrations here. There have been huge demonstrations in support of Palestine And one of the main organizations organizing them, along with many Palestinian and Muslim organizations, is Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an anti-Zionist organization that opposed the occupation for many, many years. They are being banned now, Jewish Voice for Peace, from many campuses and being denied the right to speak out their views. Another example, Nathan Thrall has published a very interesting book just a few months ago. He's an American Jew that's been living in Jerusalem for the last 15 years as a journalist, reporting on the indignity suffered by West Bank Palestinians at the hands of the Zionist occupation. And he wrote a book about a day in the life of a Palestinian man who gets in a traffic accident with an Israeli, and the way the two are treated so differently. He's not exactly what you would call, he's not calling for any violent action against Israel. He's simply reporting what happened in a story. He has been banned in half a dozen states in the United States, cannot get a lecture, cannot even present his views. This is what we call, and he's being accused as a Jew of being an anti-Semite by the Israel lobby and by their allies. Now, clearly, there are critics of Israel and of Zionism who are anti-Semitic. That's certainly, I think, the case with the Iranian government, with Hezbollah, and with the other apologists for such organizations. But reactionary critiques of Israel on the part of those kinds of forces has nothing in common with a left-wing progressive critique of Israel and Zionism. Since Israel's effort to weaponize anti-Semitism against all critics of Israel is a key aspect of its current ideological arsenal, I think we need to get the record straight by reviewing some historical facts, therefore, to go a little bit deeper into what I just mentioned. So I'll begin here. Let's begin with the beginning of Zionism. Zionism is a response to the rise of European racialized anti-Semitism in the mid and late 19th century. Anti-Semitism goes back thousands of years, but racialized anti-Semitism means it's in the blood, right? And it cannot be changed, even if a Jew converts into Christianity, for instance. That only emerges and takes off in Europe in a significant way in the mid-1800s and late 1800s, and especially in places like France, Russia, Germany to a degree too, but actually more in those countries. So Zionism begins as a reaction to that emergence of a very harsh racialized anti-Semitism, and it begins as a very marginalized movement. Most Jews did not respond to racialized anti-Semitism by becoming Zionists. At the time, that is late 1800s, right into the early 1900s, most Jews who left Europe, and there was a massive exodus of millions and millions of Jews from Belarus, Russia, what's now Poland, Ukraine, etc. Millions left Europe, but but the vast majority did not go to Palestine. They migrated to the US, to Argentina, to the UK, other countries, etc. Those Jews who stayed in Europe in the face of this rising racialized anti-Semitism, most of them also rejected Zionism. In Russia, for instance, the Jewish Bund was an organization, it was the first nationwide Marxist proletarian party formed in the Russian Empire before Lenin's party, right? It was formed in 1896, that united all Jews within the Russian Empire in a revolutionary movement to struggle for a socialist Russia, and in which they proclaimed the desire for an autonomous Jewish cultural space within a socialist Russia. They held the speaking of Yiddish, and they fiercely opposed the Zionists who were telling people, get up and just leave Russia. They thought that was abandoning the class struggle. It was also true of socialists and communists of various persuasions, which were the major political force within the Jewish political community in this period. They all rejected Zionism, and so did mainstream liberal Jews. Let me just give you one example of this. I'm going to quote from a very famous document called the Pittsburgh Manifesto, which was issued by American Jews in 1885. And it's the platform of a whole version of Judaism, modern Judaism, called Reform Judaism. This is what they state back in 1885, and I'm reading directly from the Pittsburgh platform. It states, "We consider ourselves no longer as Jews a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state of old." Now, the Zionists had no illusions that most Jews opposed Zionism at the time. That is why they tried to gain support from various state powers to get their homeland established in Palestine, just given their weakness. Now, initially, the first Zionists, some of them at least, tried to find an ally in the Ottoman Empire. That didn't work out that well. Some others, like Theodor Herzl himself, the founder of Zionism, who wrote the infamous book, Zionism, right, went to Russia, the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. In 1907, I believe it was, Herzl travels to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, to meet with Vyacheslav von Plehve, who was the Tsar's anti-Semitic minister of the interior, who had just 4 months before instigated a pogrom against Jews in the town of Kishinev that led to the murder of 3,000 Jews in one weekend. Herzl goes to the instigator of this pogrom, von Plehve, and he makes the case to him that only Zionism could end the Jewish defection to the socialists that was occurring, and therefore Russia should aid the Zionists in trying to get Jews out of Russia. Plehve accepted Herzl's proposal for the Russian government to aid immigration of Jews to Palestine. Now, the Russian government didn't follow through on it because they hated Jews. They didn't really care about what Herzl was doing, but they were interested that, hey, maybe we can use these Zionists for our own purposes. It's one of many examples of Zionists, this is why I mention it, of Zionists willing to work with anti-Semitic forces in order to advance their cause. Now, of course, as I think everybody here would know, the ally for many Zionists, by the time we get to 1917, became the UK, the United Kingdom, British imperialism, with the Balfour Declaration. And Chaim Weizmann, who was a major figure in liberal Zionism, is an outstanding example of somebody who tied himself to the apron strings of British imperialism from the beginning. And over time, more and more of the Zionist movement came to identify its fate with Western imperialism and Western colonialism. However, history doesn't move in a straight, neat line. History is multifaceted and it's complex. Zionism itself was not a monolithic movement, especially before the 1950s. It had tendencies that pushed for an alliance with Western imperialism. It had tendencies that pushed for opposition to Western imperialism. Many Zionists were socialists and communists who opposed capitalism, colonialism. Now, one could say that a left-wing socialist Zionist is a misdirected political position, and that is a position that's a view I share. I do think that they were misdirected. But one can't say they didn't exist, because they did. And in fact, for a while, they were the majority tendency in the Zionist movement. Meanwhile, some Zionists supported the Jewish state, but others did not. You didn't have to support a Jewish state to be a Zionist. The famous example, the great philosopher Martin Buber and political activist Hans Magnus moved to Palestine in the 1920s and argued for a binational Jewish-Palestinian state, argued against the dispossession of Palestinians of their land by Zionist settlers. And Buber stated in an essay written in 1922 that if the Jews do not learn to get along with the Palestinians and work with them in mutual cooperation to fight their common enemy, British imperialism, then there will be 100 years of horrible bloodshed coming that should be expected. Incredibly prophetic statement he made in 1922. Now, do keep in mind, some Zionists argued for a homeland for Palestine, for Jews in Palestine, but not a Jewish state necessarily at the expense of Palestine. But this was always a minority tendency within Zionism. And after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, this position of Buber and Hans Magnus and others became completely marginalized. And after 1967, it virtually disappeared. Although there's still adherents of this position today in Israel, but a small number. The Jewish right, on the other hand, the right wing, grew in support got much more support after the creation of the State of Israel. But the Jewish right was not initially the predominant strain in Zionism. And by Jewish right, I'm referring to the tendency called revisionist Zionism, led by one of the most important figures of the 20th century, Zev Jabotinsky. If you haven't heard of him, get to know about him, Zev Jabotinsky. He was somebody who joined this Zionist movement very early by the 1920s, and he began as a trying to court British imperialism and convince the British to give the Jews a state, not just a homeland, but a state in the Mandate Palestine. He didn't get very far with that. He moved further to the right, and he became a follower of Mussolini. Mussolini's fascism, embraced fascist ideology with all of its racism and authoritarianism, and advocated, at this time he's living, of course, in Palestine, the ethnic cleansing of Arabs, saying the only way you can have a viable yeshuv, or a Jewish community, sustaining itself in Palestine is at the expense of the indigenous population. And he openly advocated the ethnic cleansing and pushing out of Arabs. Now, at first, the revisionist Zionists who were gathered around Jabotinsky were themselves a marginal movement. They were about maybe 10% of the Zionists within Israel itself, and maybe a somewhat smaller amount outside of Israel. But they were armed, they were organized, and they used terrorism to achieve their goals. The Jabotinsky's followers, he was dead by then, but Jabotinsky's followers in 1948 were the ones who carried out the Deir Yassin massacre against the Palestinians and others that led to 15,000 Palestinians being killed during the Nakba, which precipitated the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians. And as time went on, the revisionist Zionists got stronger and stronger. At the time, in 1948, they were organized as a political party called the Irgun. And of course, the Irgun mutated over time into what is now the Likud. So the direct followers of Jabotinsky, who knew him personally, was Begin, Shamir, and of course, Netanyahu's father. And of course, Netanyahu himself is the ultimate expression of revisionist Zionism, now that is Jewish fascism, running Israel. Okay, so what began as a marginal tendency, right-wing revisionist Zionism, and that's why it was called revisionist, becomes by the 21st century the predominant variant of what Zionism today means. Now, in my view, it was only a matter of time between the right-wing Zionists would win out, since the continuous process of taking over and occupying Palestinian lands had a corrupting influence on the Israeli settlers. I want to quote here Benny Morris, who is a left-wing, kind of left-wing, liberal left-wing Israeli historian, who did a great deal to expose Israel's crimes in 1948 in producing the Nakba. And he wrote the following, I'm quoting him. This is somebody who was saying the Israelis were lying in saying that, oh, the Palestinians just fled, we didn't push them out. He said, no, we pushed them out. And he was opposed to that, at least in principle. But listen to what he writes. This is a left liberal. Quote, I feel sympathy for the Palestinian people, which truly underwent a hard tragedy. I feel sympathy for the refugees. But if the desire to establish a Jewish state here is legitimate, there was no other choice. From the moment the Yishuv was attacked by the Palestinians and afterwards by the Arab states, there was no choice but to expel the Palestinian population. End quote. Now, another thing that might keep in mind here is David Ben-Gurion, of course, the first prime minister of Israel. He had a memoir that was not published until recently, and we now can read it and see what he said about these events at the time. And Ben-Gurion states in 1948, and says a few years afterwards the same, that he was very glad to see the Irgun, who were his bitter political enemies, get the criticism for doing the dirty work, as he called it, against the Palestinians, while his wing of the Zionist movement reaped the benefits. So the point is, once someone favors a Jewish state, with all Jews having the right to return, it's necessary to establish and maintain a Jewish majority within the Jewish-controlled areas. Otherwise, the entire Zionist project collapses. So it had to, from the beginning, involve the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Occupation has a corrupting influence on anyone. When you occupy somebody else and deprive them of all their rights, it's a corrupting influence on you, including the victims of the Holocaust. Now, it's only after the Holocaust, after the Shoah, that Zionism becomes widely accepted among Jews around the world. And you can say for understandable reasons. One, because the Holocaust indicated to many Jews that European society was no longer capable of ensuring their safety. They didn't do anything to stop the genocide of the Jews, of course, during the 1940s, including British like Churchill, who knew it was happening and refused to do anything to bomb the routes to the concentration camps, right? He was anti-Semitic himself, Churchill. And secondly, many Westerners, like the Western powers, like the US and the UK, had way back, it had nothing to do with Zionism, but way back in the 1920s, had imposed severe restrictions on Jewish immigration to their countries. In the US, the 1921 anti-immigration law that was passed by Congress reduced Jewish immigration by 97.5% between 1 year and the next. And that drop was permanent for the next 40 years in the United States. Most of the Jews who came to the United States had to have come before 1921. It was very hard to get in after that until after 1965. So there were reasons why people were attracted to the illusion that Zionism would and the state of Israel would produce a safe haven for Jews. But the lesson is that suffering profound depression, I think the lesson of history is that suffering profound depression is no assurance that you will be delivered from evil. That especially if you impose suffering on others in response to your own oppression. If you do that, you take on the traits of those who oppressed you. And if that can happen to Jews, frankly, it can happen to anyone. And it can happen to anyone, not just historically in the past, it can happen to anyone today. Now, there's another critical historical factor that has to be considered. Zionism was a project initially of Jews from Germany, Poland, and Russia, Ashkenazi Jews. It had no traction among Jews in the Arab world, the Mizrahi, nor did it even attempt to have any attraction amongst them. Ashkenazi Jews often looked down upon Jews living in North Africa, the Middle East, etc. And the Zionist movement had no organizational basis there and had no traction in those countries. Now, keep in mind that many of these countries in the Arab world had huge Jewish populations. Yemen was close to 1/3 Jewish. Baghdad was 30% Jewish as late as the late 1950s. I don't have to tell anybody here the role of Jews in the history of Morocco, Algeria, etc. So whereas racialized anti-Semitism provided the soil for Zionism, the absence of racialized anti-Semitism in the Arab Muslim world, where the Jews were widely accepted and had considerable rights far surpassing what Jews had in Europe, the absence of such a virulent oppression in the Arab and Muslim world rendered the question of Zionism a non-issue. With some exceptions, Jews were pretty well integrated into these Arabic, North African, Berber, etc. societies, and including Iran, by the way, we should mention. Very few were interested in Zionism from those areas and had really no reason or no desire to go to Israel, at least initially. But in 1948, bitter over their defeat in the 1948 war, the Arab regimes expelled most of their Jewish population. And 600,000 Jews living in predominantly Arab countries were expelled in that year to Israel. Now, this was a colossal blunder. It played right into the hands of the Zionists, who wanted a Jewish majority, and a bigger Jewish majority as possible now that they had their state. And as it turns out, in response to discrimination that these Mizrahi, that is non-Ashkenazi Jews, faced in terms of discrimination from mainstream Jews and Zionists of European origin, the Mizrahi tend to vote more right-wing. They actually served as the political base for revisionist Zionism. And today, the Mizrahi continue to help swing Israeli elections to the right. So this is one of the peculiarities of Israeli politics. Those who are, that I don't want to overgeneralize, but that is a phenomenon. Now, of course, the 600,000 Jews who were kicked out of Palestinian lands had a privilege that the Palestinians of the Nakba did not have, a state to go to, a homeland to go to. But imagine what would have happened if those Jews had not been expelled from Arab countries and had retained their livelihood in those areas and had not gone to Israel. Think of how different history might have turned out. So Zionism was part of a neo-colonial enterprise insofar as it sought the assistance of imperialist powers, such as the United Kingdom, to establish a Jewish majority in Palestine at the expense of the Palestinian populace. But here, too, the history is not as simple and one-dimensional as many tend to paint it. For instance, many people assume that the United Kingdom was British imperialism was fervently pro-Zionist from 1917 to 1947, and that there was a straight line. Zionism was nothing more but a project of the British Foreign Office. Well, folks, I'm sorry, but it just ain't so simple as that. Now, there were periods where the UK actively promoted Zionism, but other periods when it did not. Take the Balfour Declaration of 1917. It called for a Jewish homeland in Mandate Palestine. But actually, read the text. It didn't call for a Jewish state of Palestine. That's a difference between a Jewish homeland in Palestine versus a Jewish state of Palestine. Now, of course, the Zionist movement completely tried to cover over that difference and pretend that wasn't the case. And they heralded the Balfour Declaration as giving them license to carve out what they really wanted in the long run, which was their own exclusive Jewish state, at least the section of the Zionist movement that desired that. Yet, keep in mind, a lot of the British ruling class did not favor the Balfour Declaration. And there was intense political debates over the next 30 years about whether it should or should not be considered relevant anymore. The UK favored a Jewish state in some periods. You can talk about the 1936 Peel Commission, for instance, in which the British outlined a small Jewish statelet that would only comprise basically the area around Tel Aviv and a little bit of the Galilee, but left out the West Bank and Gaza, of course, but also accorded the Negev and much of central Israel, what's now central Israel, and Jerusalem to the Palestinians. But nevertheless, it was a small Jewish statelet that was put on paper by the Peel Commission, but the Peel Commission report was not adopted by the British government officially. And at other times, the British government blocked Jewish immigration to Palestine, especially in the 1940s, in order not to alienate its support within the Arab population, which Britain was having a very hard time controlling because of obviously Arabs and Palestinians' objections to British imperialism and colonial domination. Now, this is the reason, because of these twists and turns in British foreign policy, this is why the revisionist Zionists, the right-wing Zionists that I talked about, launched a terror campaign against the British Army in the 1940s. Now, keep in mind a couple of things. The mainstream Zionist organizations had an armed wing, the Haganah, that was formed in the 1920s, a military wing of the mainstream Zionist movement. They engaged in ethnic cleansing as early as the 1920s, and certainly in response to the 1936 Palestinian National Uprising, and engaged in some pretty horrific acts. This is the mainstream Zionist military organization. But in the 1940s, when World War II breaks out, the Haganah decides to ask the British Army to incorporate them within the British Army. That is, they ally themselves with British imperialism in response to, as part of a united front or popular front against fascism. And so they basically are folded into the British Army of Occupation of Palestine. So there you have a very clear instantiation of how the mainstream Zionist organizations and British imperialism were working hand in glove. But don't forget, what did the Irgun, the revisionist Zionists do? They opposed the Irgun for this. They opposed the Haganah for joining the British Army, and instead they fought the British Army because they were impatient to get their Jewish state, and the British hadn't yet given it to them. So the Irgun engaged in a very vicious terrorist campaign against the British Army, which killed hundreds of British soldiers. And I'll give you one example of one of their terror tactics. What they would do is they would attack a British base, the Irgun. They would kill so many soldiers. Then before they withdrew, they would booby trap the dead bodies of the British soldiers. So when the British soldiers come up to pick up their dead comrades and try to bury them, the bomb would blow up in their face and kill them. By the way, the same exact tactic is used by the Russian army right now in its invasion of Ukraine. They booby trap their own soldiers' bodies so they can kill more Ukrainians. This is pretty, obviously, I don't have to tell you, absolutely dehumanizing what the Irgun was doing. And so much so that when the news of this reached the British press, there were anti-Jewish riots in London in 1946 because of people's horror against what the Irgun was doing to the British army. So the right-wing Zionists hated the British, unlike the liberal Zionists who liked the British, and unlike the Zionists far left, which supported the USSR. Now, let's get to that one. What is also often overlooked in the recounting of the history is exactly how Israel got created. Well, we all know it got created through a vote at the UN that imposed the partition plan of 1947. This disastrous partition plan of saying there would be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, etc., that we all know about. Now, also, how could that plan get arrived at unless it had the support of the Security Council? And it did. And that meant it had to have the support of Britain, France, and the United States, which all voted for the partition. But there was a fourth country on the Security Council, and that was the Soviet Union. What was the Soviet Union's vote? It cast the deciding vote in favor of the creation of Israel. If the Soviet Union had voted no in 1947, there would have been no UN partition. It would have been vetoed by the Soviets. But the Soviets didn't. They went along and allowed for the creation of Israel. Now, why did they do that? Why did Stalin allow this? Well, there's a lot of debate about this, but among historians, but there might be two reasons. One, Israel at the time had a very strong communist party, got about 10 to 12% of the vote. The Soviet Union had nothing like that in terms of support in the Arab regimes, and it didn't want to alienate its support, perhaps within Israel, among the Zionists. Plus, you have to keep in mind the Arab regimes that attacked Israel in 1948. This was not Nasser. This was not the later Arab nationalist, independent, secular regimes that fought Israel in 1956 and 1967 and afterwards. These were reactionary semi-feudal monarchies, and the Soviet Union didn't want to be too closely identified with them. Of course, it changed its mind about that later. Furthermore, where did Israel get its weapons to fight the Palestinians and drive them out from so much of what they called Israel in 1948? What allowed them to carry out the Nakba? Where did they get their weapons from? They did not get the weapons from the British. They did not get the weapons from the Americans. They got the weapons from the Czechs at the assistance of the Soviet Union. That's where they got their weapons. Now, does this mean that the birth of Israel was not a product of imperialism? Not at all. Certainly not if you admit, as I do, and I argue for this, that the Soviet Union was also an imperialist power. But of course, there are many on the left then and now who would refrain from affirming that that was the case. So they simply ignore this aspect of history because it doesn't fit with their way of looking at things. Now, of course, the USSR soon changed its stance to an anti-Zionist position as Stalin in the early 1950s, for various foreign policy reasons, decided to curry more favor with the Arab regimes, but also because of his own turn towards outright anti-Semitism, as in the Doctor's Plot. As many of you probably know, in his last days, Stalin had given the order that Jews in Russia should be gathered up and sent to concentration camps, or at least sent to Siberia, because of his paranoia over a Jewish conspiracy against him. So Israel does end up becoming allied with Western imperialism as that superpower conflict becomes predominant in the Cold War. And nothing shows that more powerfully, of course, than the 1956 Suez Crisis. By that time, Israel is completely in the lap of the British and the French, and they join with them to try to take the Suez Canal away from Egypt, which the U.S. objects to and forces Israel and Britain and France to pull back, because the U.S. wanted to make it clear that it's not Britain and France who run the show anymore, it's U.S. imperialism. So, just as the 1948 Nakba undermines the illusions of leftist and liberal Zionists in a so-called progressive Israel, the 1956 alliance of Israel with France and the UK made it crystal clear that it was in the bed with imperialism. And with 1967, that becomes even a more extreme turning point, when now it's the US replaces France and Britain as Israel's main arms supplier, and the occupation is extended to millions more with the conquest of Gaza and the West Bank. And Gaza, Golan Heights, of course. From then on, it's kind of all downhill. The Lebanon invasion of the 1980s, the Shabra and Shatila massacre, which is clearly an act of genocide in Lebanon, the total settler apartheid on the West Bank, which is actually worse than apartheid in South Africa in many respects. I can give examples of why, in some respects, the apartheid on the West Bank especially is worse than what was imposed in South Africa against blacks. Isolation and strangulation of Gaza for the last 17 years. Well, the Zionist dream becomes what? A complete nightmare. So, clearly, the Zionist dream, which was the whole point of Zionism, of a homeland safe for Jews, one place in the world where Jews can go and not have to worry about being killed, has proven to be an empty illusion. There simply is no more dangerous place in the world today to be a Jew than in Israel. And with this, the whole rationale for Zionism collapses. All that is left is bloody might and vengeance. Now, it's surely correct that Israel bears the marks of a colonial settler state. But a colonial settler state can be understood in different ways. Does a colonial settler state mean that refugees fleeing oppression have no right to live there or to stay there? Does a colonial settler state mean that the non-indigenous population must be expelled from it or exterminated once that colonial settler state is dismantled? Now, Algeria prior to 1962 was clearly a colonial settler state. 10% of its population were French settlers. And the Algerian revolutionary movement had no more powerful a spokesperson than Frantz Fanon. Yet Frantz Fanon's vision of a post-colonial Algeria included not only freedom for Arabs and Muslims, but also Jews and members of Algeria's European minority, so long as they supported the struggle for liberation. Unlike the Islamist and narrow nationalist elements of the FLN, he opposed pushing them out after the attainment of independence. He died a few weeks before Algeria gained its independence, of course, maybe a few months, and didn't live to see the results, but he would not have been happy to see the results. So does it make any sense to argue that since Israel is a colonial settler state, that the creation of a free Palestine from the river to the sea means that the Jews must leave? And if they refuse, they must simply be killed or whatever. Well, that would be absolutely absurd. There are 7 million Jews between the river and the sea. Yes, the West Bank settlers must be removed, all 600,000 of them. These are some of the most reactionary people on earth. I've met a few of them. You don't want to meet them. They are really nasty, horrible, reactionary people, racist to the core. You can't deal with them. They're not an enemy to be discussed with. They're an enemy to be defeated. But you cannot cast out or seek to eliminate the 7 million other Jews without your own national liberation struggle repeating the very same mistake that the Zionist one made. Israel is not the first example of an oppressed people becoming the new oppressors, but let's hope that it is the last example. It's a very tragic example. The Israeli state illusion that it can make the Palestinian issue, and indeed the Palestinian people, disappear is an illusion. The simple fact is Jews and Palestinians, 7 million of them or more, a piece of each one of them, they're stuck with each other. Neither are going to go anywhere. The only way out is a political solution that recognizes Jews and Palestinians as equal citizens, bearing the same human rights, free of domination and exploitation of one by the other, and without any possibility for racist, ethnic chauvinism and discrimination against one group. Now, all that seems an awful long way off. And it's very hard to be optimistic about the outcome of this conflict. Anybody tells you that they have the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, in my view, is either fooling themselves or lying. It's very, very hard to see how this is going to play out in the long run in a positive direction. That's what makes it a tragedy. But, well, all this, what I've mentioned just now, seems a long way off, that type of a different kind of a mutual recognition and a free society of a truly free Palestine. It seems a way off, since Israel has worked so hard to bury the very idea of a two-state solution, and the nature of a one-state solution that ensures equal rights for all is hardly what's on the agenda right now, or at least what's being propagated either from the side of Israel or on the side of Hamas. That does not mean it doesn't remain the goal to reach for. So I want to end, therefore, by quoting something that Frantz Fanon wrote in The Wretched of the Earth, when he stated the following, quote, "Hatred, resentment, and the legitimate desire for revenge alone cannot nurture a war of liberation. These flashes of consciousness, which fling the body into a zone of turbulence, where my blood calls for the blood of the other, this passionate outburst in the opening phase, disintegrates if it is left to feed on itself. Of course, the countless abuses by the colonialist forces reintroduce emotional factors in the struggle and gives the militant further cause to hate and new reasons to set off in search of a colonist to kill. But day by day, leaders will come to realize that hatred is not an agenda. So here's my concluding point. Zionism is a tragedy that should never have happened, but it did happen, and we have to deal with the fact. It's a tragedy because it shows the transformation into opposite of so many people who were oppressed into now the oppressors. If the only tale to be told is, hey, from start to finish, this is conflict of Israel and Palestine is nothing but an imperialist plot cooked up in the British Foreign Ministry's office. Not to say there isn't some truth to that, but if that's all that the narrative is about, then you don't have to deal, that there's no tragedy to deal with. There's nothing tragedy. For a tragedy, there has to be a contradiction and a fall, not a straight line. A straight line is not a tragedy. And if you ignore the tragedy, you ignore the depth of the problem. This is not just about history, it's about today. We have to ask, how do we ensure that the oppressed never again become the oppressors? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for